Hey guys, Greg here, Bone Tactical. In this video, I'm gonna help you not look like a fool when you're buying a knife. This question a lot of guys ask out there, the first question out of their mouths is, what type of steel is it? And from the perspective of a knife maker or anyone who knows about knives, this is a dumb question. It automatically tells somebody who's not ignorant to edged weapons that the person asking the question doesn't know about edged weapons. And so normally when that's the first question I get asked, I try not to do this, but I oftentimes give a dumb response because dumb questions get dumb responses. So a lot of people have maybe received a response from me that isn't what they were hoping for. And so in this video, I'm gonna tell you what are the most important questions you should ask when buying a knife. So stay tuned for this video. It's gonna be a really quick kind of knife buyer's guide. I'll do a more in-depth knife buyer's guide in the future that's gonna cover everything, but what this is gonna do is help you not look like an idiot. Help you at least look like you know a little bit about knives to get started. So there's really two questions you never ask. First, you never ask how much something is as the first question because price does not indicate value. You first want to find out what the value of the item is and then see if the price is comparable. That's just a life tip. When it comes to knives, your first question should never be what type of steel it is, because there are three questions that are much more important. Three things you need to learn about first. What are they, you may say? Okay, the three questions that you should ask first that will allow you to make an intelligent decision on whether to purchase the knife or not, and allow you to ascertain whether the knife in question is quality or not, as well as helping you not look like an idiot, are what is the edge geometry of the knife in question relative to its intended use, number one. Number two, what is the design of the knife relative to its intended use? And number three, if the knife is made from steel, which is the large majority of your knives, what is the heat treat process? Who does it? Do they know what they're doing? And was there a quality control process involved? Of course, when asking about the heat treat, the type of steel will come into question. If you'd like to know more about knife steel, I have two videos that cover everything you need to know about knife steel. And again, it's not what you think it is. The actual difference between usability and effectiveness of actual approved knife steels is minuscule, meaning that a good knife steel or a decent knife steel, it's much more important on how it's heat treated, the edge geometry, and the design, rather than a super steel over something as simple as 1095. So these are your three questions. I'm really quickly gonna cover each one and explain to you what to look for with each question. Give a few examples here. This is the Tradecraft Kank. Very, very thin knife. So edge geometry is pretty simple. It has a grind that you can't even see up higher on the blade here because it's so thin, but it is important. And then it has another grind angle here on the very tip. This knife, the Tradecraft Kank, for its intended purpose, is basically a budget self-defense tool, EDC knife, backup blade, cover all your needs, small enough to be concealed. But when we're talking about the three questions that we should ask, how does that apply? Edge geometry. The edge geometry is correct because of the thinness of the knife. That's edge geometry means the grind angles, but the edge geometry also means the purpose. I'm not gonna use this knife for prying. I'm not gonna use this knife for batoning bushcraft chores because it's thin, it's light, it's a concealed carry design blade. Now, look at the difference in edge geometry on this heavy Bowie knife. This is the Bushranger Bowie. It is an extremely thick knife, super, super thick. So edge geometry is so important with this knife because it has to have a completely different grind in order for it to even be sharp, all right? And what is a knife designed for? It's designed for cutting. So in order for a knife to be an effective cutter, to hold an edge, keep an edge, So the edge doesn't break, isn't easily damaged, but is still sharp. It's incredibly important, the edge geometry. This being very thick, it has to have a beveled grind, right? Concave grind, primary grind angle here, to get that thick blade down to a thin blade. So then when we put the final grind angle on here, so this here is concave, and then you have a final grind angle here. What does that mean? That allows a very thick, very strong, tough knife to still be shaving sharp and strong at the same time. If I just put a normal flat grind on here, the knife would never be that sharp. If I messed up and put too thin of an edge on here, then the knife would not be strong. Pretty much any steel will cut with the right edge geometry, even the worst steel in the world. But we start to get into heat treat, and that is what allows a knife to have edge retention, toughness, resharpenability, not the steel itself, because heat treat is what wrings and exacts these properties out of a steel. The steel does not have these properties naturally. You have to heat treat the steel properly. Even if it's a super steel, will lead to an inferior knife to something like 1095, which is basically the cheapest good knife steel out there, but properly heat treated, it'll blow the doors off a super steel knife that has some errors in the heat treat process. Now, when you start getting into really good quality steels like 5160, high carbon steels that are time proven, and then you get a guy who's a master heat treat knife maker, they're able to do incredibly beautiful, amazing things. These 5160 knives are just nasty tough. Along with the edge geometry, they're crazy sharp, and just that's what we're looking for. Just being a fool and saying, hey, what kind of steel is it? You're not gonna understand anything about the knife, and it doesn't indicate anything about the knife, the steel by itself. So design and edge geometry go hand in hand, right? You do want to know about the design of the knife because the design matters. What was the knife built for? Okay, a lot of people think that a ring pommel knife might be stupid because you have to use the ring pommel. Well, a ring pommel, for example, is just something that's been used on the Gladius or so many knives for so long. It's just a swell at the bottom of the knife to keep my hand from slipping off. It doesn't have to be used with a finger in it. But it also can be used with the finger in it in certain holds, right? In order to be more effective with the blade, and so the blade doesn't fall out of your hand, especially if I'm operating. If I have a pistol in my hand, wow, look at that now. Now I can shoot, move, communicate with a knife in my hand without it falling out. So there's a design, you have to look at what the knife is designed for, who's designing the knife, if they know a thing or two about combatives. If it's a bushcraft knife, you go to a bushcraft guy, right? And somebody who knows something about bushcraft, but they also have to have the experience and the knowledge of the heat treat process. That's why knife making at an elite level is so difficult. That's why there's so few people who are able to do it effectively. Now, this particular knife, it's not designed for chopping cinder blocks or busting holes in walls or punching through metal. Although it can do all that, it's specifically designed for stabbing, okay? And then right here, it's specifically designed for cutting, right? Slashing and stabbing. So the edge geometry has to go hand in hand with the design of the knife itself. Materials, of course, you know, you don't just want a beautiful wood on the handle. In this case, it's granadillo, which has to be a certain type of hardwood that you want to use. You want to find a hardwood. I could use ironwood, for example, but ironwood's very fibrous. It can splinter and chip apart, and that's not what somebody's going to want on their knife. So I would rather use a mahogany that's not extremely hard. People think mahogany or granadillo. Granadillo is much better because it's harder than mahogany, but what's the benefit of mahogany? It's a very well interlaced grain pattern that doesn't splinter. So although it's not a crazy hardwood, mahogany you could dent just by beating it on things, but it's not gonna splinter. So all materials, the science behind them has to be understood. And this granadillo wood is very similar to a mahogany, but harder and a little bit even more beautiful. The only real difference as far as desirability is it doesn't have a nice sweet smell like real legitimate mahogany has a nice smell to it. And that's why I think it's better used in homes and furniture and stuff like that. The funny quick story behind mahogany, it became so popular because the Spanish fleet during the time of cannons decided to build their boats out of mahogany since mahogany doesn't splinter. And the cannonballs would essentially do less damage to the boat and then wouldn't cause splintering, which would kill sailors on the boat just by the wood splinters of other woods, even if they were harder. It's flexible, it's a great wood for certain things, but everything about the knife, everything about the materials matters. That's design. You have to have the knowledge. Everything matters to the intended purpose of the knife. So your questions should be, what is the knife designed for? Is the edge geometry in line with what the knife is designed for? Who's doing the heat treating? I'll give you some other examples of heat treat. This particular blade right here is a type of 1095 that I'm using, which has a little bit of chromium and vanadium added in, just a small amount. And they call it some people call it Crovan. It's just 1095 steel with a little bit of other elements, trace amounts of other elements added in to help a little bit better bonding and give it some better properties at the atomic level. But I still just call it 1095. The heat treating process for this knife versus the Tomahawk are incredibly different. And this knife is different as well because it's 5160. These knives are through hardened, all right? I heat the entire knife to a certain temperature. After forging, after thermal cycling, then I'm heating this entire knife to a certain temperature, exact temperature, cooling it at an exact speed in a certain type of oil in an exact time, has to go from the forge to the oil in a certain amount of time, and then it has to cool at a certain amount of time. Then it has to go to tempering, that's hardening. Then it has to go to tempering. For each steel, this is different recipes, by the way. Then it has to go to tempering. It could be 1, 2, 3 cycles of tempering at other specific temperatures. The tempering is what gives the toughness into the steel because this is brittle and it could even break right after the hardening process. It might be 64 Rockwell when I'm done hardening it. But guess what? It could break. If I just hit it with a sledgehammer, it could break. So I add in crazy amounts of toughness via the tempering process, and that's all part of heat treat. Now, the Tomahawk being 4140 steel, it's completely different. I can flame harden this. So I can either use a rosebud on a cutting torch, I can use the forge, and I can heat the 3 contact points to a certain temperature, and then harden each one of these 3 contact points. And I don't even have to temper it because of the type of steel that it is. If I harden it correctly, it's differentially heat treated, meaning that it's soft and smooth and even can have some shock absorption properties in the handle, while the hardness at the 3 points is extremely hard, but it's not brittle because I exact it to a certain exact temperature and then flame hardening, which is great for impact tools. That allows this to be used to puncture metal, anything, and not sustain extreme damage, chipping through heavy concrete. It allows this surface to be used for cutting and chopping as well. There's no knife that's gonna have to withstand as much force as a grown man swinging in a pendulum motion like a tomahawk and smashing into something. This edge geometry has to be a lot thicker and fatter here in order to withstand that, but also in order to have a sharpness. I can shave with this tomahawk, yet it's still not gonna break. And one of the reasons that the Rockwell hardness is a little lower as well. So in worst case scenario, if I do bang it into a hardened metal object, it's not gonna chip the blade, it's just gonna roll a little bit, which is part of the science there of the heat treat as well. Making sure the blade doesn't chip, and if it just does roll a little bit in a certain point, I just sharpen it a little bit to get that roll out of there, and then I'm good to go. So all of this is what's really important. These are the 3 questions you should ask. What's the edge geometry? Is it properly designed for the intended purpose? Who's doing the heat treat? Did they do it right? Is it all done in-house? Is there an amount of quality control that they're doing with their heat treat? and stop asking what steel it is as the first question, and you'll look less like a fool. Thanks for watching. Bone out.